Thank you so much for having me, and thank you so much for having a bookstore.
Well, independent bookstores are the lifeblood of the democratic process, and I think that's one of the main points of all of your books is what does it mean to live in a democracy? Why and how do we as citizens, as an informed citizenry, define it? And so I look at all of your books as leading us that way. So a good journalist do that, and great nonfiction writers do that. So I want to thank you especially for being a part of that discussion. Let me ask you just a little bit about First Platoon and some of the philosophical underpinnings of it, because of course when someone mentions Foucault and Bentham
Mhm.
as two of the sort of like pillars of their thought, Bentham's Panopticon and Foucault's thoughts on the prison system. What, how did those two writers and thinkers shape your ideas?
Mhm. You know, First Platoon in many ways is like two different stories. I tell this story of a young platoon or a platoon of young soldiers who go to Afghanistan and their deployment ends abruptly in catastrophe. And on the other hand, you have the story of this growing database that the Pentagon seems insistent upon building. And in that is this frame of some very philosophical components, as you say, because having written 6 books now about the military and the intelligence world in a sort of post World War II environment, it's always been about war fighting, it's been about, and as we move into the counterinsurgency wars, it's been about gentlemanly warfare versus ungentlemanly warfare. But suddenly in First Platoon, I was faced with this astonishing idea that I had not even examined before. And that was this idea that American soldiers are now being asked to act like cops on a beat. And that is a direct quotation from Captain Swanson, who is in charge of the platoon. Acting like law enforcement officers in a foreign war theater is an anathema. It's not what soldiers signed up to do. And it's, in an interestingly way, not what most Americans believe to be going on. And so by looking at Foucault, who talked about prisons, and by looking at Bentham, who was talking about this surveillance state hundreds of years ago, this idea that humans could be influenced if they thought they were being watched. I mean, this really made my head spin because, of course, the world was a very, very different place in terms of technology when Bentham was writing than it is now, where you actually can look at someone all the time. That's terrifying to me.
Right. It seems like that you draw on these two philosophical, I mean, the giants, to really say there's foundational ideas. People have been thinking about this for a long time, and now
Mhm.
you may not know it, but we're living it.
Absolutely. And the first question that I'm asked on this Zoom book tour is, what is identity dominance? What are biometrics? And so underpinning all of this is this idea that what is happening right in front of our very eyes or over our very heads is completely unknown to most people, because the systems that I write about, these surveillance systems, these biometric tagging, tracking, and locating systems that were created for the war theater to find, fix, and finish terrorists, fix being a euphemism for kill, have now come home.
Right.
And so people say, well, what are biometrics? I don't even know what that is. How could it really affect me? And yet it has the frightening undertone that by the time people come to really realize what a very serious threat to democracy this all is, it is in essence too late.
That's something that readers, by the time they get to the end of your book, and you're almost presenting it like this is a cautionary tale, and it's a tale of really, I mean, you could say identity, and the identities of these soldiers in First Platoon from the 82nd Airborne, and how the war experience shaped them. Really, for some of them, and very tragically, they lost their lives or died at their own hand or suffered grievous injuries. I mean, there's that element of their identities and how those are changed by war. And I know that some of the soldiers you interviewed talked about going in one way and then coming out another. So there's that element of reshaping the identity of the warrior, really. And then there's that larger kind of decision by the DoD and then the presence of the FBI to, okay, we're going to identify the enemy, we're going to monitor the enemy, we're going to do this in Afghanistan. And I think this will work. And uh, it was almost an absurdist play. I felt like if Monty Python had shown up there, they could have created a strange, absurdist comedy about the darkness and the disaster of what's asked of these soldiers, but then also the civilians, and then the competing elements, the problems with technology. How do you wrap your head around how do you inform yourself? I guess that's where I'm going with this. How do you inform yourself about this subject and these technologies?
I love origin stories. And the reason I love the origin story is because I deal with these very complex issues, and my goal is to narrate them in the most simplest terms. I mean, having written all these books, I've had the great fortune of interviewing people who have been considered among the smartest scientists in the world, people who advise the presidents. And really, the smartest guys in the room and the smartest women in the room will always tell you that you should be able to explain anything to a second grader. Meaning, and then that's actually like paraphrasing Einstein, meaning information that is super complex should be relayed simply. I mean, that's the hallmark of journalism. In essence, we write for like people that are in high school because it's the most inviting way, by the way, to tell a story, I think. And so often I go into subjects not really knowing much about the subject matter myself. And I think that that's what makes me a friendly writer, if you will, like someone who is not my works aren't intimidating. They're certainly not meant to be intimidating. And the way I do that is by, you sort of scratch your head and you say, wait a minute, how did this all begin? Right. So I'll just take you quickly through this. If you really think about the sort of midpoint of Afghanistan is where this idea of identity dominance began. So 2009, and again, most Americans don't know this. All the bigwig generals, McChrystal and Petraeus, they all suddenly decided, we are going to solve this human problem of insurgency, which we can't win, through technology. And we're going to do it by identity dominance. We're going to create a catalog of all the people in Afghanistan, their fingerprints, their DNA, their iris scans. And then we're going to have this catalog of everyone so that when a crime is committed, meaning an IED going off and killing American soldiers, we can then figure out who was the criminal. I mean, right here, as you said in your introduction, this gets us off to a very complex issue right off the bat, where someone should have said, gentlemen, this is a terrible idea. We're not there to enforce rule of law. We're there to win the war. But that idea had already been upended, and an actual program called Rule of Law in Afghanistan had been set up. Again, most American taxpayers have no idea about this. And so then you must say to yourself, as I did, how did this, where did this begin? It certainly didn't start in this moment. And then I went back to the origin story of 9/11 through the story of the FBI agent Paul Shannon, who was looking for fingerprintable body parts in the rubble of the Twin Towers, this incredibly terrible job, because he was an expert, a special agent with the FBI, an expert in fingerprinting. And as Shannon explained it to me, he realized that American special forces were about to go into Afghanistan, and what they needed to do was be able to identify fighters fleeing the battlefield. And that is precisely where it all began. And if that seems like a needle in a haystack, Shannon's idea was to grab these guys fleeing Tora Bora as the bombing campaign started, fingerprint them, take their DNA for later use. And so it was kind of a noble idea. It was an idea with good intentions, but it seemed very much like, I'm not so sure how this would work. And then came this astonishing moment in the history of biometrics, which few people know about, but will absolutely, through the long lens of history, become a moment in time where this all began. And that's when Shannon unwittingly takes fingerprints of an individual who identified himself as the falconer. The guy was, a young, scraggly, Saudi student, and says, "Oh, I'm just a nobody." And the information goes into what was then the FBI's database. Shannon gets a call a few, months later, and someone says to him, "You're not going to believe this." And the man, the falconer, was in the FBI's database, which only meant one thing in 2001, early 2002, and that was that he had been fingerprinted by federal law enforcement inside the United States. And as it turned out, this astonishing story is that that man was supposed to be the 20th hijacker on 9/11. There were 19. Mohammed al-Qahtani was his name. He had been arrested, rejected entry at Florida because a customs officer suspected he was up to no good. And later, the FBI found out that the lead hijacker, Mohammed Atta, was waiting for this man at the curbside. I mean, it's an astonishing story, and it was literally a 1 in 6.5 billion person find. And again, and that's how you introduced this story, that it sort of begins with these great expectations. My God, can you imagine if you could stop the next 9/11? That's how it all began. And as you said, it just becomes a series of missteps that become, more grievous and more into the downward spiral.
When I read that about Al-Qahtani at the airport and then Muhammad Atta out there waiting for him, I just thought, oh my gosh. I mean, it's one of those moments where you just think, wow, it's an incredible entryway into, like you said, an origin story. And that's why your books are so well crafted, because the importance of storytelling, the importance of how to get from point A to point B, and then this origin story. 9/11 is understood so many ways, but it wasn't understood this way until you wrote this book. And that's what, for me, I was just amazed by it. When we think about Afghanistan, I think a lot of the public now is really receded from awareness of it. And what do you think? You've written this book that places Afghanistan, the troops there, this issue of technology and surveillance, front and center.
Mhm.
What do you think about trying to tell the story when the public really has been, or maybe you don't agree. I'm assuming has disengaged from understanding Afghanistan.
I mean, disengage, I think, is a polite word, and it's a generous word, right? And again, I mean, who can blame? There's no blame to go around. I'm not, no one, none of us would say you must know about Afghanistan. I mean, people make their own choices about what is interesting to them, and that is important. But as I wrote all of these books, I felt like I had to write First Platoon because it it took it just was sort of the icing on the cake of this culmination of looking at technology, our whole post World War II effort to see technology as a solution. And this is the great conundrum, because in our private lives, technology, I mean, I watched, you know, NASA land the rover on Mars today, you know, within seconds of when it said it was going to. It was just remarkable. And all of this is technology born of Defense Department, by the way, all of it, as I write in the Pentagon's brain. And so technology in our lives, we couldn't be here on Zoom in the middle of a pandemic were it not for the ARPANET, which is now the internet. So technology is this just remarkable way of life, but technology cannot win wars. And the more books I write about warfare, the more I think that becomes evident. And so my hope, to your question about very few, you know, people have disengaged from Afghanistan, that may be true right now. But as a journalist whose job it is to inform the public, I think that it's valuable to write the book that you need to write next. And, you know, sometimes a lot of people read them in that moment, and other times the book is read perhaps later in context of when it was written. And so, you know, we kind of, we do what we do what we do.
I think that readers and anybody who will go out and talk about your book, like several of us have already, are going to connect it to COVID-19
Mm.
and the way that the company that was doing the data collection right in Afghanistan has received the contract to do the data collection for people who are being tracked with COVID-19. I'm correct on that, right? And I want to say
Yes,
maybe it's a little more nuanced, I'm sure, than that.
well, you're absolutely right. And this is like, you know, what off of the what we were just discussing about technology and how fascinating it is in all of our lives. I think it's very interesting the way technology itself is often vilified. And the case in point would be Palantir. That is the company that you're referring to, which is a data aggregation company. And what's interesting is, as I write in the book, and I always aim to be the neutral journalist who is just giving you the information and let you draw the conclusion. I am fascinated that much of the news coverage of First Platoon has been about portraying Palantir as the big bad twirling mustache evil. Now, this is fascinating to me because Palantir is a technology company that aggregates data. In essence, it is a neutral company. It has clients who, according to Palantir acts as the connective tissue between the client and what the client is executing, which is sort of a interesting word when you look at the Defense Department. And so I think it would be wiser to examine who the client is and what they're executing rather than necessarily focus on Palantir. Because in the situation with the Defense Department is using Palantir to aggregate data in order to kill people in the war theater. And the operators who were using that information in the war theater said to me, whoa, what Palantir is capable of is terrifying. And they know best because they are the operators. Now we have a situation where I was just as shocked as anyone to learn that Palantir has been given the contract to aggregate the data of your data, my data, health data, bio data of COVID-19. And I think the moral of the story is, when you really look at it, is that the client, Health and Human Services, which, by the way, has a budget twice that of the Defense Department, what the client is doing with that data is unknown. And that is the question that should be asked, not why does Palantir have the contract? It's what is HHS intending to do with the data? And of course, HHS doesn't want to answer those questions. And I think part of it is that they don't really know. And as I write, in the book, that a lot of times the technology is essentially smarter than its operators.
Well, yeah, exactly. I was just thinking about this technology deployed in Afghanistan, the soldiers taking iris scans, swabs, fingerprints, but not really clear. And of course, they're following orders, right?
Mhm.
And there's a very compartmentalized need to know. They don't all know what and why and how. But then beyond that, some of this technology is not really working right. And that to me was deeply disturbing. You have a journalist who, just kind of puts his info in there, biometrics in there, has a hit that's not him. And then Kevin H, who is they're going to kill the man in the purple hat,
Mhm.
and he really has to stop it practically at the last second, and it's the wrong man. I am, and that's just two examples. It's so well placed where you put those two stories, because it's sort of like the foreshadowing. Because here we go, folks. We're going into, you think this is bad. Wait do you see what's coming, and then to what end is all of this data being gathered, and how can we predictive crime fighting, is
Mhm.
that even possible? It raises all of these questions, which I just think you do such an amazing job of addressing for us as citizens in a democracy who are supposed to really be thinking about it. And it's not easy to think about when, as you pointed out, just a small group of people are really the ones who know what's going on with this data, how this technology works, and then how it may or may not be used. But how do we find that out? And you're just, to me, I see you kind of going through the jungle, pulling back the leaves, trying to say, look over here, everybody, look over there, because there's a lot this technology is out there, and we do not have enough answers.
This idea that video can be captured of people, um, just sort of open-endedly, was born in Afghanistan. And this is when you refer to Kevin H. For anyone listening, what we're talking about is a system called a persistent surveillance system. And that is this idea that full motion video is just going to cover down on an individual person, a group of people, a whole village, now in the United States, a whole city, and simply capture video ad infinitum to store for a later use in the event that there is a crime. Now, you can look at two sides of that and say, what a wonderful thing. When there's a crime, we can just roll it back and look and see who did it. But where on earth is the issue of the right to privacy in this? And this is a very significant thing to think about, because while these ideas are being debated in the courts, is it plausible to just have a camera over my house watching me? This is all happening at a snail's pace. And meanwhile, the surveillance technologies and the big defense contractors that are behind pushing this technology overseas in the war theater and now at home to law enforcement agencies, their technology is moving forward at lightning speed. And so there is an imbalance. And that is where we're running up against a very significant problem with rule of law. And rule of law is this concept that everyone's talking about, rule of law, as if it's this shining concept on a hill, which it is. And in many ways, it's being completely hijacked to mean a whole bunch of different things than it is.
When you think about the all the people you interviewed, you have so many young men, and then you have these sort of seasoned FBI agents, police officers, government bureaucrats. It's just this amazing cast of characters on this great stage. Some of them very tragic, and then for the really competent and well-meaning, they're watching things fall apart.
Mhm.
And the good ideas really corrupted or destroyed. As you were thinking back on the people that you've interviewed, who struck you or some of your kind of standout people integral to telling this story? Are there a few that, I know all of them are important or you wouldn't have included them, but who are a few that really stood out to you?
Well, certainly the working with the soldiers of First Platoon was remarkable, and I'm ever intrigued by the idea of need to know, right? So what do we need to know, who needs to know it, and why does someone know something? And the reason why I find this so interesting is because it always reflects, it's a mirror back to the self. One wants to look at their own life and say, what am I not seeing whenever you're faced with a challenge? And so these young soldiers, 18 and 19 years old, getting out of high school, going to the war theater, having these very sort of almost romantic ideas about war fighting, about historical ideas, talking to me about different books they read and movies they saw, that they were the brotherhood of men, and then finding out that they were cops on a beat, and they were in essence, in many ways, being used by the Defense Department, because they were not going there to, as they said, kill Taliban. They were going there to capture fingerprints on villagers, and being shot at in the meantime. And so every single one of their stories was so important to me, because they each had such a unique perspective on what they knew then, and then talking to me 6 years after the fact, me explaining to them some of these oh my God scenarios. For example, they had no idea that there was a camera over them in
Right.
a surveillance balloon watching them. They had no idea. And there's kind of a misery that comes with that when you feel like, how come I didn't know? So all of their stories are important to me. On the FBI side of things, I was one of my favorite people to learn from was Tom Bush. And, here's a guy, I really believe in experience making you an expert. And Tom Bush ended up being the director of CGIS, and that's the second most important, or the largest office at the FBI, and it deals with all the biometric information. And he, in the moments after 9/11, he reported to Robert Mueller, the director of the FBI, who reported to President Bush. But he took me back in time to how he learned how to understand fingerprints. And this goes to that origin story. The people I respect the most are the people who have the knowledge from the ground up. And Tom Bush was one of those guys. This information he once said to me just blew me away, because now, of course, fingerprints are all electronic. But Tom Bush was schooled back in the 1970s when he was a young FBI agent. And he said to me, Annie, we used to call it flipping and picking. And he would actually sit there. He was called a clerk. They weren't even FBI agents. He said he was the lowest of the low. And he ended up rising to almost to the highest of the top, right? And he said, if I'm standing next to a person, I can look out of the corner of my eye at the tips of their fingerprints, and I can recognize the whorls on the tip of their fingerprints, and determine if they're a criminal if I've looked at their fingerprint cards. And I thought, my God, that kind of expertise, that's someone I want to learn from. And so when I was dealing with these very lofty ideas down the road about the Defense Department's big bad biometric database it calls ABIS, and all kinds of, what I might call blowharded officials telling me that I didn't know what I was talking about. ABIS was this, foolproof system. I could go back to Tom Bush and say, what do you think about this? Because no one knew more than him. And he could point out to me where the inaccuracies were, who I might want to talk to. And when you're a journalist working with that kind of a of an expert who is generous with their knowledge, and is can freely admit when they don't know something, that's just a benefit to all of us.
Well, I think it was so important because you get involved in this case with the soldier Lawrence. I may
Mhm.
not be, maybe I didn't say his name correctly, who receives a presidential pardon, and the attorneys Maher, or maybe that's not how he says his name, but I mean, I've never seen a moment where they're showing you information and you're saying, no, this is actually not correct, and you actually knew more than they did, or they knew it and didn't care.
Mhm.
And I wonder if you anticipated that that was going to be that was almost, if it were a mystery, if this were a crime novel, it was
Mhm.
the surprise twist for me in this book that you wound up dealing with that too. How did you experience it? Am I mischaracterizing it to describe it that way?
You absolutely hit the nail on the head. And this book, more so than any book I've written, had the real-time plot twists. I went into the story thinking that perhaps the army had, in error, identified the civilians at the heart of the war crimes case, which emerges at the end of the book. I went into it thinking that the army had misidentified these individuals and that the individuals killed were, in fact, terrorist bomb makers, because the world's experts in biometrics who had taken on the cause of this first lieutenant named Clint Lawrence took that position, went to 8 members of Congress with it, and then all the way to the president of the United States. And these were experts in this world. And one of the most important issues of the biometric database that I make, and it undergirds the whole narrative, is that how dangerous that we have a system that is understood by a very elite few people that is now going to be controlling a lot of rule of law issues. And so I went into it thinking that the error was the armies. And only in filing my own Freedom of Information Acts to confirm this information that was being presented to the president as accurate was I dumbfounded, literally dumbfounded, to learn that the lawyers for Clint Lawrence had, in fact, bamboozled the president of the United States into thinking something false was something true, and they based it on biometrics. And even more astonishing, the person that was closest to the president at the time, then Secretary of Defense Mark Esper, had been the Secretary of the Army previously. So it was so confusing, because how could the Secretary of the Army not be setting the president straight on this information? It was a great mystery to me what on earth was going on. And only in filing all of these FOIAs and having people like Tom Bush, the former CGIS director of the FBI, to consult with and counsel me, was I able to realize, my God, the biometric systems are so rarefied and elite that they can now be used to manipulate the president of the United States. And that is, I think, it's the spoiler alert of the book. But again, it's so complex and it's almost meant to kind of make you dizzy. I think the way it's presented, it was presented by the lawyers, but using, you know, my style of, let's just make this as simple to understand as it can possibly be. I hope that I was able to convey that information in a manner that people can come to the conclusion of, there's really something wrong with this system.
Well, if I bookmarked with my little cute penguin bookmark here, my favorite chapter, and it's chapter 19, True Identities.
Mm.
And I think that I'm so glad several things you said made me want to mention. One of the key elements of the way you write is the issue of transparency. I very rarely see a nonfiction author who uses FOIA so deftly. Put in there, this is the FOIA letter. This
Mm.
is when I wrote it. This is what I was trying to accomplish. And this is when I heard, and this is what I got. I
Mm.
love this chapter so much. It's every one of your books, and Area 51 is like this too. There's like a little little jewel in the middle of it somewhere that a reader is going to find and say, wow, this is the curtains back, and this is how it works, and this is craft. And I guess that's what I'm really saying. I love that chapter so much. When and I told you earlier that I think, your superpower is FOIA for sure. Could you tell people a little bit about using FOIA requests and what it means to use them, and any problems? You talk about it in that chapter, but if you wouldn't mind saying a little bit about it.
Yes, I mean, the FOIA is a hallmark of democracy. It allows people to request information that is being withheld from them. It doesn't mean that you always get that information granted, but in many cases you do. And I do find that persistence pays off. The reason why I specifically, took the reader through that moment is because it was just as astonishing to me as I think it is to the reader, to also humanize the people behind the FOIA requests. And these are real people. I'm a real person as a journalist, and it's not, it's not that complex to ask questions and really insist on answers. And I think one of the greatest values of being a journalist is sometimes what someone refuses to say is just as important, And so you get to sort of put a spotlight on, when you can put a spotlight on a FOIA officer who is quick on it and gives you that information back, and in a no nonsense way is able to have a dialogue with you, through the written word. I find such incredible value in that. And in the same way, when I try to contact, Mark Esper through his Pentagon staff, and they respond to me, 11 times with a no, and I make note of that in the notes, I think that's equally important, because you realize that people, when they are asked to be held accountable, will often become better civil servants because of it. The converse of that is the people that get to fail upward. And that's we see that all the time. But I do think that there is headway being made because of so many citizen journalists at this point.
Well, I think about other, your book, and then I put it alongside Barton Gellman's Dark Mirror. And I really see, if anybody wants to know, right, where are we today? Where is the United States today? And looking at us abroad, our projection of power abroad, and what we're doing at home. I think those two books, yours, First Platoon, and his, are just the must reads of really the last decade. And I am so glad that you wrote this book, and again brought us into the lives of these soldiers, but also good civil servants. We need to see them. They are sometimes, if you don't live in Washington, D.C., or you don't have someone in your life, it's really through journalists or other nonfiction writers where we're shown what kind of dedication it takes. And I think Tom Bush is one of those people.
Mm-hmm.
For sure. I'd love to give you some questions from the audience if you're okay with that.
Absolutely.
Okay. And so let's see. This is a question from Tony. And his question is, was the biometrics effort a military industrial complex boondoggle? And then the B component is, was it a prelude to or an adjunct to the rule of law concept?
What a great question. And so the first part of it is it it absolutely was a military industrial complex boon. You could say boondoggle, but very specifically, it's a group of scientists at the Pentagon called the Defense Science Board. I also wrote about them in the Pentagon's Brain. And they told then Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld, this is right after 9/11, that the way in which to win the war on terror was through and this is a quote, Manhattan Project like program to tag, track, and locate people before they committed crimes or before they, in the war theater. And this was almost immediately given an $8 billion budget, and it took off from there. So the second part of the question about rule of law, equally important, that, from what my understanding is, came really to the fore later in Afghanistan, after biometrics had been used in Iraq in somewhat of a different manner. Suddenly, the idea was to create this massive program in Afghanistan called Rule of Law in Afghanistan. And this was this enormous endeavor to set up the three pillars of law enforcement in a foreign country, my God, that didn't even have a functioning government. And that was to set up law enforcement, police, courts, the justice system, and corrections, the prison system, in this case, detention centers. And that's, I think, where, when you look at that in the book, and I try to explain it simply and just, here's the narrative, but you really, looking back, you have to think, what a terrible, terrible idea. Here is a country with no functioning government, and we're going to impose upon them a Western style rule of law. I mean, within months, the Defense Department learned that people didn't even have deeds to their homes to indicate that they owned their homes, let alone any kind of a paperwork system to be able to deal with law enforcement, courts, and corrections. So bamboozle or bamboo is probably a tragically accurate word.
Another question connected to biometrics from our public is, let me get to it, sorry. Okay. I'm toggling here. Okay. As a long time, this is from Pat, and she says, or he says, as a longtime follower of your work, one conclusion I've drawn is, quote, if not us, the US, then who, end quote. And with that in mind, how would you recommend a young adult begin a career in biometrics?
That's an interesting question. It brings us back to what we were discussing earlier about technology, that technology advances all of our lives, and that forward lead that the US takes is remarkable, and it's aspirational. So I think, as an individual with a career ahead of you, Pat, it sounds like, or maybe you're speaking of your children, it's, there's no doubt that biometrics is a burgeoning new world. I think as individuals, we have to decide, what do we want to do with that? I mean, another interesting theme that I'm always dealing with is, particularly as I interview people who are older, and scientists, is individuals who look back through the long lens of history on their life and contemplate whether or not they think they did the right thing. And this came into play a lot with the Pentagon's Brain. Some of the scientists who, they expressed to me, and these are particularly with the Jason scientists, who are sort of at the heart of the weapons making programs for the United States, and sort of that this is the foundational work for biometrics. A number of them said to me, expressed regret or remorse that they hadn't spent more time pushing science toward the benefit of society, as opposed to destruction, which is really what war comes down to. And so maybe, to answer the question, is the best way is to almost imagine yourself in the future, looking back on your life and saying, what is it I want to have done?
There's just so many. I mean, I think of Operation Paperclip there too. There's just so many examples of people who think they're doing right or doing something good for humankind, or maybe they don't.
Mhm.
And then that, it's that pyramid of choice, right? The little incremental steps that lead down to a disturbing conclusion.
Mhm.
There's another question here. This is from Amy Cherricks, I told you about earlier, who's our bookseller, children's book buyer too, and just wrote In the Shadow of the Moon. Her question is, social media is one giant panopticon.
Mm.
Does our comfort with sharing our identity online run the risk of diminishing American outrage over the use of this type of government surveillance technology?
Mhm. Well, look, the facial images that you see that people post online absolutely becomes a standard for facial recognition software later. And so, as I wrote in the book, one of the new law enforcement tools that's like kind of very controversial is called Clearwater, and it's the ability for a policeman to identify someone, like that. And I was with a police chief here in Los Angeles, and we did a test, and I just walked up to him on the street, and him holding his iPhone up within 1/1000, he was able to identify his phone was able to identify who I was. And he showed me, and I am a public figure, but there was not just my public photos, but every photo that I had ever posted, in succession, identifying me as me. And that's that data aggregation that a software company like Palantir has at its, and I want to say fingertips, that's of course metaphorical, but this is part of the information that is being stored and compounded and aggregated about us. And that is that complex term that many people scratch their heads and say, and it's the subtitle of my book, identity dominance, right? So this idea that the Pentagon or a law enforcement agency or even someone who wants to sell you something can know more about you than you by an algorithm that makes sense of you based on all this biometric human measurements about you, the distance from your ear to your chin. The Pentagon now has technology that can identify a human heartbeat, the veins on your wrist. This idea is only gathering momentum and strength. And yes, our obsession with social media is building this system.
I'm thinking about there's a book, and the title is gone from me now, but I'll get it. We will be harmonized. I think it's about China and the use of surveillance technology in China. And there, of course, come my cats growling at each other. It's not an event. I had the door shut too. They just broke in, Annie. It's a coup.
Mhm.
Um, it's this there's a question from one of our audience members about how this technology has been deployed in the United States, and you've touched on it there, but you also do mention China. You mentioned that, and I kind of described the battlefield or the theater of war as a lab. It's a place where there are just all kinds of experiments. I think Pentagon's brain is a wonderful example of that too. What's going on in the United States with this technology that you discuss? If there's more you want to add, and what about in other countries?
Mhm. I think one of the most terrifying areas is DNA, and I don't say that lightly, because when we think of DNA as a biometric, um, it is the only biometric that can be captured really completely unwittingly. In other words, our iris scans are now taken. If you go to the airport and you stick your head in that machine, you think maybe it's taking your photograph. It's actually taking your iris scans, and those iris scans are going into the database. Um, Facial images, we can look up and we can see the cameras. We have an idea of who's taking our picture. Fingerprints, in the United States, you still have to cross with law enforcement and be, to have your fingerprints taken, unless you do it wittingly for a passport. DNA, a microgram of DNA can be left behind without you knowing it on, for example, my teacup. So, and I write about a story in the book where a 12-year-old boy was suspected by and this was reported originally by two very intrepid New York Times reporters. And a 12-year-old boy was suspected in a felony crime. And he was called into the police station with his mother. And NYPD detectives offered him a McDonald's soda, which he accepted. And when he was done with it, the detective wearing gloves took it away. And the reason that the detective was wearing gloves was because the straw was removed and micrograms of the boy's DNA were pulled from the tip of the straw. And the boy's genetic fingerprint was delivered to law enforcement, to detectives, based on that, to be matched against crime evidence. Now, as it turned out, this 12-year-old boy was not charged with a crime and was not involved in the crime. And charges, he was no longer a suspect. But when his mother learned that his genetic fingerprint was now in a law enforcement database, it took her, from what I understand, over a year and the help of, some very serious civil rights attorneys to get her son's genetic fingerprint removed. And that's a cautionary tale for all of us.
Well, that raises a question that there's all of this data that's been gathered in Afghanistan. I'm sure Afghanistan was not the only theater of war where this has happened now. The Afghanis, do they have any ability to get their data back? I mean, it doesn't really seem like it's the rule of law.
Mm-hmm.
Who has control? Where are the rights? And how could Afghanis appeal or exercise any rights over this data? It's deeply disconcerting.
And of course, they have no rights over it. And I learned that the database, which is called ABIS, the Automated Biometric Identification System, this database is in the United States, in West Virginia, in what is now the first jointly run FBI Defense Department organization, the first of its kind in the history of the United States, which is troubling to the legal scholars that I talked about, because it sort of merges this idea of law enforcement with war fighting. According to Tom Bush, that database has, as he said, holes and labyrinths, meaning it was a very ineffective system. And he pointed out to me this really creepy detail, that this database that houses all the information of the Afghanis and of the Iraqis and of so many other foreign people overseas, way beyond their control or really knowledge, that this database sits in the basement at the FBI headquarters, the Biometric Center in West Virginia. And it just conjures up this kind of Wizard of Oz image, in my mind anyway, about power and need to know. And ultimately, that frightening notion, which is exemplified in the Clint Lawrence bogus pardon, that, the information posing as this sort of, impenetrable, indomitable truth is in fact very easily manipulatable.
Well, that I'm going to ask you the last question of the public event. You've done a lot of research and discovered a lot of things that would probably, I guess, curl your toes is an understatement. How has this latest book, or even the accumulation of your books, changed you? And what do you do to kind of absorb but just retain some? You seem very optimistic. You seem hopeful.
On top of all of it, I still think America is this incredible country with, I'm a patriot, I really am. And I do not think that patriotism should be a nasty word. I'm terrified by that also. It's just that there's, for me, information is king. And learning about history and learning about all of this Defense Department activity and intelligence community interweave, it really actually makes me less frightened for today, because you realize, oh, humans are the same. We rise, we fall, we aspire, we fail. But ultimately, the forward march of science continues us on. And that is a good thing. But where I think the trouble is where people begin to think that the time where we are now is somehow, the worst it has ever been. And I disagree with that entirely. And I think that's one of the great, actually, something that leaves you optimistic after you read history, even the modern history of the United States since World War II, because you realize, oh, here we are again arguing about this and that. And hopefully let's move toward something that is actually, strengthening our society and really our ability to communicate with one another and have different ideas about things, but be able to agree on the idea that, democracy is really the best thing going.
Well, I think that's a wonderful way to conclude this public element of our event. I want to thank Annie Jacobsen for being with us this evening to discuss the First Platoon, and I'll hold it up for everyone again. A story of modern war in the age of identity dominance. Please support your local bookstores. Malaprops really does believe in what Annie just said about the importance of democracy and informed discourse. And we hope that wherever you are, you're drawing inspiration from Annie's statements this evening and her body of work. And we thank you all for being here this evening. And we're so appreciative to you, Annie, for taking time to join us this evening. We thank you. And good night.
Thank you so much for having me. Thanks everybody for coming.